Little girl gave a rescue signal to a mafia boss. What he did next shocked everyone. Do you want to know? If you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. It happened on a sun-drenched street in the heart of New York City. The sidewalk was a river of suits and tourists, the air thick with the roar of yellow cabs and distant sirens. In the middle of all that chaos, a little girl named Jane walked with a forced, mechanical gait, her vibrant green dress a stark contrast to the grey concrete. Behind her, an average-looking man kept a heavy hand on her shoulder. His arm, marked by a twisting snake tattoo, held her just a second too long, just an inch too tight. No one in the bustling crowd looked twice, except for Bruce, standing by his black car, his broad shoulders filling a custom suit and a striking tattoo climbing his neck. The city's most feared mafia boss stopped dead in his tracks. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. In that single, breathless second, Jane lifted her hand and made a silent signal. A gesture of tucked fingers Bruce recognized instantly, the universal cry for rescue used when words are too dangerous to speak. Bruce froze. He had built an empire on the art of observation, reading micro-expressions that meant the difference between life and death. He knew a girl that young didn't make that signal by accident. He also knew the man clutching her hand wasn't her father. Stay with me until the end, because the secret Bruce uncovered about this little girl, and why she chose the most dangerous man in NYC to save her, would eventually shock the entire department. Before we get into the confrontation in the alley, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's go back to the moment Bruce realized his high-stakes meeting didn't matter half as much as the wilting look in Jane's eyes. The sun beat down on New York's Fifth Avenue, turning the sidewalk into a shimmering furnace of heat and noise. Jane's bright green dress should have caught the light like an emerald, but to Bruce, watching from the cool shadows of his SUV, she looked like a dying star. Her gait was stiff, an unnatural, mechanical rhythm that screamed of a child performing a role under duress. Every few paces, her small frame would hitch, a silent instinct to run that was immediately suppressed by the man beside her. Gary Miller looked like every other overworked father in Manhattan, unremarkable, bland, a face designed to be forgotten, but his hand told the real story. It wasn't resting on Jane's hand. It was clamped over it, an iron shackle of skin and bone. On Gary's forearm, a dark snake tattoo coiled tightly around his wrist, its fangs appearing to sink into the crook of his thumb as his muscles flexed. Every time Jane drifted an inch toward a storefront or a passing police officer, the snake would tighten. The skin on her knuckles was white from the lack of circulation, yet she made no sound. Jane kept her eyes locked on the cracked pavement, avoiding the gaze of the thousands of commuters rushing past. She was a ghost in the machine, invisible to the world but painfully present to Bruce. He had spent 30 years reading the geometry of violence, the way a predator herds its prey, the subtle shift in weight before a strike. This wasn't a family outing. It was an abduction in broad daylight. Behind Bruce, the door to the office building opened. His associates, hard-faced men in sharp suits, stepped out, checking their watches. The shipment meeting was about to begin, a negotiation that would secure Bruce's empire for the next decade. Missing it would be viewed as a sign of weakness, an invitation for war. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a text from the Torino family asking for his location. Bruce didn't reach for the phone. Instead, his eyes locked onto Jane just as she dared to look up. In that microsecond, she raised her hand near her chest, palm out, thumb tucked, and her 4 fingers snapped down like a closing trap. It was the silent cry of a girl who knew she was out of time. Gary jerked her arm, pulling her into a sharp right turn toward an alleyway where the sunlight didn't reach. Bruce's hand hovered over the door handle of his black SUV, his empire on one side and a wilting girl in a green dress on the other. He felt the cold weight of his pistol against his ribs and the heavy silence of his men waiting for his lead. "Follow them," Bruce whispered, his voice like grinding stones. "And don't look back." The scent of stale coffee and exhaust fumes clung to the air as Bruce stepped out of the SUV, leaving his silent bodyguards to watch the street. His hand, heavy with a single gold ring, paused over the door handle, his eyes fixed on the narrow mouth of the alley where Jane and Gary had just disappeared. The decision was not a choice but an inevitability. Bruce Bellini, a man who measured his life in calculated risks and brutal certainties, had just thrown a decade of strategic planning into the wind. He could feel Vincent's eyes on him, a silent question passing between them. The shipment meeting, the one that would secure their territory against the encroaching Torino family, was not just about money. It was about respect, about power, about blood. To miss it was to invite a war. Yet, the image of Jane's desperate signal, the silent plea of a child, burned hotter than any territorial dispute. Bruce didn't bother to check his watch again. Time had ceased to matter the moment their eyes met. The city noise, once a chaotic symphony, now faded into a dull thrum. All he could hear was the echo of that tiny hand signal, a desperate cry for help in a world too busy to notice. It wasn't just about rescuing a child, it was about a fundamental breach of order, an offense that went against the core of his own twisted moral code. Predators who hunted the innocent were beneath contempt, and the city's concrete foundations were built to swallow men like Gary Miller. "Vincent," Bruce's voice was a low growl, "take the car. If anyone asks, I'm indisposed. Handle the Torino situation. I'll call you." Vincent, ever loyal, nodded, his face impassive. "Boss, the meeting." Bruce cut him off with a single, raised finger, a gesture that commanded absolute silence and instant obedience in their world. "The meeting can wait. This can't." He turned, his custom suit rippling with the controlled power beneath. His gaze was fixed on the grimy opening between two towering buildings, a dark fissure in the bright cityscape. The alley smelled of forgotten trash and something far more sinister. He heard the subtle clicks and rustles behind him as his bodyguards, without a word, adjusted their concealed weapons, preparing for the inevitable. But Bruce walked alone, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement, each step carrying him deeper into the city's underbelly, toward the unknown. The alley swallowed him whole, leaving the sunlit street and the urgent demands of his empire behind. The only thing that mattered now was a little girl in a green dress and the monster who held her. The transition from the vibrant chaos of the New York sidewalk to the alley felt like stepping into an open grave. The temperature dropped, the air turning thick with the smell of wet cardboard and ancient soot. Bruce moved with a predator's silence, his heavy coat flaring slightly like a shadow detaching itself from the wall. 50 feet ahead, Gary Miller had pinned Jane against the grimy brick. The average man's mask had finally shattered, his eyes were wild, darting, his normalcy replaced by the frantic, twitching energy of a rat that had finally dragged its prize into the dark. Gary didn't hear Bruce approach. He was too busy digging into his jacket pocket, his breathing heavy and jagged as he leaned into Jane's space. Jane was a statue in green, her small back pressed into the cold masonry, her silent tears cutting tracks through the urban grime on her face. As Gary pulled a silver object from his pocket, Bruce cleared his throat, a sound low and deliberate, echoing through the narrow fissure of the buildings like the hammer of a gun cocking. Gary spun around, his face twisting from malice into a sharp, jagged panic. His hand froze near his waist. "Back off!" he shrieked, the pitch of his voice betraying the cowardice beneath his snake-tattooed skin. "This is my daughter. We're going home." Bruce didn't stop. He took another step, his presence filling the alley, his neck tattoo stark and menacing against the collar of his suit. "Your daughter," Bruce repeated, his voice a gravelly whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "That's a bold lie to tell a man who's been watching you for 3 blocks. A man who knows exactly what that green dress signifies against these grey walls." The predator backed up, his heel catching on a rusted dumpster. He looked at Bruce's expensive shoes, then at the muscular bulk of a man who looked like he could dismantle a city block with his bare hands. Gary's bravado crumpled into the desperate, cornered aggression of a trapped animal. His hand dipped back toward his pocket. "I know who you are, Bellini. I know you can't get your hands dirty with the FBI crawling up your neck. If you touch me, we both go down." Bruce's smile was a thin, bloodless line. He didn't care about the heat, the shipment, or the law. He watched Gary's fingers tremble, sensing the exact moment the average man was going to lunge. "The difference between you and me, Gary," Bruce said, closing the distance until he was within arm's reach, "is that I don't need a witness to be a monster. And Jane over there? She's waiting to see if I'm the monster she signaled for." Gary made his move, lunging forward with a hidden blade, but the air in the alley seemed to shatter as Bruce's hand shot out like a lightning strike. The predator's scream was cut short as Bruce's hand clamped around his wrist, a sound like dry wood snapping under a weight. Gary Miller collapsed against the dumpster, his silver knife clattering uselessly against the pavement as Jane huddled back against the brick, her green dress trembling like a leaf in a storm. The air in the alley was stagnant, heavy with the realization that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Bruce held Gary's wrist in a grip that defied escape, his eyes never leaving the smaller man's face, yet his presence was a shield, standing between the monster and the girl. "I didn't do anything," Gary stammered, his bravado replaced by the high-pitched whimpering of a trapped animal. "I was just taking her home." Jane's voice cracked through the tension, small but piercing in the shadowed alley. "He's not my dad," she whispered, her hands clutching the dirty fabric of her dress. "My real dad is Mike, Sergeant Mike Miller. He's in Afghanistan right now, fighting the bad guys so people like me can be safe." The words hit Bruce with the force of a physical blow. He looked down at the girl, seeing the intelligent, calculating gaze she had used to signal him on the street. She was the daughter of a soldier, a child born to a legacy of courage, being hunted in the very city her father was deployed to protect. Bruce felt something stir beneath the cold layers of his own criminal history, a flicker of recognition, a reminder of the price paid for freedom and the debt owed to those who stand in the gap. Jane reached into a hidden pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, creased photograph, holding it up with hands that had finally stopped shaking. It showed a man in military fatigues, smiling broadly with Jane on his shoulders. "He says some people have to do hard things to protect those who can't protect themselves," she added, her eyes locking onto Bruce's with a far too much wisdom for an 8-year-old. "Are you going to be like my dad, Mr. Bruce?" Bruce took the photograph, his mind already spinning through the implications of who she was and the depth of the betrayal she had faced. He knelt down, bringing his tattooed neck to eye level with her, his voice gentling as he filed away the details of Sergeant Miller. "Your daddy is a hero, Jane," he said, his gravelly tone shifting to something approaching comfort. "And right now, that makes me the only soldier you've got on this block." He stood up and turned his full, frigid attention back to Gary, whose eyes darted toward the mouth of the alley where Vincent stood, like a well-dressed wall. The predator realized that the Mafia boss hadn't just intervened to save a child, he had intervened to protect a soldier's home, and the justice Bruce Bellini dealt out was rarely found in any court of law. Bruce's grip on Gary's arm didn't just hold the man, it anchored him to the reality of his own demise. Gary whimpered, a sound like a wet floor under heavy boots, his eyes searching for any flicker of mercy on Bruce's face. He found only the cold, unyielding masonry of a man who lived by an ancient code. "Please," Gary choked out. "I told you, I have a life. I have people who think I'm good." "That's the difference between us, Gary," Bruce said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration. "People think you're good, so you hide in the light and pray nobody sees the rot. Everyone knows I'm the monster. I live in the light and the dark, and I own every sin I've ever committed." He jerked Gary closer, the snake tattoo on the predator's arm, looking pathetic and pale against Bruce's massive, ink-etched frame. "You snatch a hero's daughter because you're too weak to face a man. You think you're like me? You aren't even the dirt on my shoes." Bruce reached into his inner jacket pocket. Gary flinched, expecting the cold steel of a silencer, but Bruce pulled out an encrypted phone. He dialed a number that didn't exist in the public directory. "Detective Jenkins," Bruce said, his gaze never leaving Gary's shattering face. "I'm in the alley off 5th and 42nd. I have a package for you. Her name is Jane Miller. Her father is Sergeant Mike Miller, deployed. I suggest you bring the heavy cuffs. The man with her is Gary Miller, and he has a collection of habits that are going to make your career." Gary's mouth fell open, a silent scream dying in his throat. He had expected the quick, dark end of a mafia hit a shallow grave under the city. Instead, Bruce was handing him to the system. "You can't," Gary stammered. "You're a criminal. You're Bruce Bellini, which is why the police will believe everything I tell them," Bruce whispered, leaning in so close Gary could smell the expensive tobacco and the iron certainty of his voice. "I'm handing them a monster on a silver platter. I'm not going to kill you, Gary. Death is an escape. I want you to spend the next 20 years in a concrete box, wondering if every shadow that moves in the yard belongs to me." The distant, low-frequency thrum of sirens began to echo off the canyon walls of Manhattan. Jane moved closer to Bruce, tentatively reaching out to touch the heavy fabric of his sleeve. Bruce looked down at the girl, his face softening for a fraction of a second, the only witness to the man behind the boss. "Detective Jenkins is coming, Jane. She's a friend. She'll get you home to your mother." Gary sank to the grimy ground as the blue and red lights began to dance against the brick walls at the mouth of the alley. Bruce stood over him, a mountain of outlaw justice, watching as the law arrived to finish what a monster started. The blue and red strobes of the patrol cars transformed the grimy alley into a pulsating theater of justice. Detective Sarah Jenkins stepped through the mouth of the alley, her trench coat flapping against her legs, her eyes immediately finding Bruce Bellini. In New York, their relationship was a silent pact written in the margins of the law. He kept the chaos contained, and she didn't ask questions she couldn't afford to answer. But tonight was different. Tonight, Bruce was handing her a gift that would burn a hole in the city's criminal record. "He's all yours, Sarah," Bruce said, his voice a low vibration against the screech of approaching sirens. He stepped back into the shadows, a mountain of ink and tailored wool, allowing the uniforms to swarm Gary Miller. Gary was no longer a threat. He was a broken man, a weeping heap in the dirt. As the handcuffs ratcheted tight, the metal clicking with finality, the predator looked up at Jenkins, trying to find a sliver of sympathy. "He hit me," Gary sobbed, pointing a trembling snake-tattooed hand at Bruce. "That criminal. He's the one you should be taking." Jenkins didn't even look at Gary. She walked straight to Jane, kneeling in the grit to offer the girl a warm, woolen blanket. "I don't see any criminal here, Gary," she said, her voice like cold steel. "I see a man who prevented a kidnapping, and I see a file on my desk with your name on it that's about to get much longer." The officers dragged Gary toward the light of the street. Bruce watched the predator's shoes scuffing the pavement, knowing that once Gary entered that precinct, the paper trail would begin. It wasn't just about the abduction. Jenkins would pull every thread, every cold case, every park disappearance, until the legal machine crushed Gary into a forgotten number. In prison, a man who snatched a soldier's daughter had a shelf life that could be measured in hours. Bruce had made sure the paper trail included a note to the right people behind bars. Jane held onto the blanket, but her eyes were fixed on Bruce. She saw the detective taking the photograph of her father, logging it as evidence that would eventually bring Gary to his knees in a courtroom. The signal for help had done its work. "Detective," Bruce called out as he reached the mouth of the alley. Sarah Jenkins looked up. "Make sure the sergeant gets a call. He needs to know. His daughter fought like a soldier today." Jenkins nodded, a rare, grim respect flickering in her eyes. Bruce stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, the NYC noise swallowing him whole as he vanished into the crowd, leaving the law to mop up the wreckage of a monster. 6 months had passed, but for Jane, the world had been permanently recolored. The sterile gray of the New York winter had given way to a vibrant, blooming spring. Inside the crowded school auditorium, the air hummed with the restless energy of parents and the smell of floor wax. Jane stood on the stage, the fabric of her same bright green dress catching the stage lights. She didn't look at the cracked pavement anymore. Her head was held high as she demonstrated a simple, powerful movement. Palm out, thumb tucked, fingers snapped down. "This is how I told a stranger I was in trouble," Jane told the hushed room, "and this is why I'm standing here today." In the very front row, a man sat as still as a statue, his dress uniform crisp, the brass of his medals gleaming. Sergeant Mike Miller, home from deployment, watched his daughter with a look of raw, unshielded pride that surpassed anything Bruce had seen on the streets. Mike reached out to hold his wife's hand, their fingers interlacing a grip of safety, not of control. Jane's eyes finally found his, and for a second, she was just an 8-year-old girl again, glowing in the warmth of a hero who had made it home. Way in the back, tucked into the deepest shadows of the final row, Bruce stood unnoticed. His expensive black suit blended into the darkness, the striking tattoo on his neck concealed by a high collar. He hadn't come for the applause or the recognition. He had come to see the math of his decision fully balanced. Gary Miller was a ghost in the state system now, buried under a paper trail that would never let him see the sky. As the auditorium erupted into a standing ovation, Mike Miller stood and saluted his daughter. Bruce allowed himself a single, bloodless smile. He had spent his life building an empire on reading lies, but today, watching Jane run into her father's arms, he was looking at the only truth that mattered. He turned and walked out before the lights came up, his heavy boots silent on the carpet, disappearing into the NYC afternoon. Behind him, the doors closed, sealing Jane into a world where the monsters were finally, truly gone. Thank you for watching to the end. I believe you enjoyed it. We have a lot of other interesting stories like this lined up for you already, so click the image showing on your screen to watch the next. Don't forget to subscribe.